The title for this evening pulls in a couple of different themes. So one was a piece about 21st century skills. So I'd like to just maybe outline what those skills are, and then we can move on from there. So when we hear schools or educators talking about 21st century skills, we're talking about collaboration, communication, creativity and innovation, problem solving, responsible citizenship, and especially as our how students access information changes, information literacy. So what I'd like to do is to start by talking about where I think we are as a nation and also as a state in terms of education reform and as it relates to 21st century skills. Talk a little bit about my experience with my students and how it relates to the work of Facing the Future. So some of you may know that Facing the Future is a leader in curriculum development and professional development in global issues and sustainability. And so the title for this evening, as I said before, pulls on some of those, but what I'd like to invite you to think about is how school systems based on 21st century skills can help us shape, and the sustain piece I'd like you to think about is, and sustain effective American schools. So we're using the sort of lens of sustainability, but thinking about sustaining our own schools. So as a public school teacher, it can be really demoralizing to listen to some of the conversations about the state of American public education. The national discourse depicts our schools as broken institutions that require superhuman effort and resolve to repair. During the past decade, the focus has been to design tests that help us measure what our students know, especially in terms of English, math, and science. Teachers and districts have been pressured to raise test scores and prepare students for these tests. In many, though it's important to note not all, schools, the test preparation becomes the driving force for instruction and assessment. And most importantly, it drives funding, which then becomes this sort of self-perpetuating. Students are assessed in reading, writing, and math computation. These are foundational skills, not 21st century skills. So after a decade of No Child Left Behind, we've seen that while money and time put into testing has raised test scores, our students' knowledge has not necessarily expanded, nor have their skill set expanded. Many students who pass these same tests are often asked to take remediation courses in college. So somehow this testing culture is not working for us. At the surface, this might appear to be disheartening, but I believe that we're at a moment of great possibility and great change. People are asking fundamental questions about where we are with American education. The question that I'm most interested in is, what is the purpose of education in our country? If the purpose is to help our students become good people, capable workers, and thoughtful global citizens, then it's time to stop treating them like test scores. We need curricula, assessments, and pedagogies that allow our students to communicate, investigate our world, evaluate differing perspectives, and empower them to take action. Focusing on 21st century skills offers us a holistic framework for designing standards and assessments, learning environments, and professional development. In Washington State, we're not starting from scratch. I'm not sure if you know, but that many states look to Washington State for some of our social studies assessments, in part because we had some great leadership at the state level that really, when we were developing assessments in math, English, and science, they were traditional testing assessments, traditional tests. In social studies, we moved more towards project assessments that encourage our students to do research, collaborate, communicate, and problem solve. So in an issue, in trying to be transparent, I'd like to put on the table that I believe that every student wants to learn. And so I think that one of the myths that is circulating in our country is that students are coming to school because they have to and they don't want to learn. That said, we have reluctant learners. And so one of the questions that I sit with is, why are my students reluctant learners? And there are lots of reasons, some of them in part because of what's going on at home for them. But for me, there's two main reasons. The first one is some of them have experienced failure in school. And so they enter the classroom with an experience of having failed maybe once and not provided the opportunity to think through that and to problem solve that. And so then they assume that they can't succeed, and then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But to me, as an educator, the biggest problem is that we are not engaging our students. We are not engaging them with relevant curricula that they can walk into a class and know why they need to learn what's happening that day or why they're working on that skill set. So I'd like to share with you two different examples from my teaching practice about how I've worked on issues of sustainability using some of the resources from Facing the Future to help my students and to engage them. So before I do that, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about my teaching context. As Jeff pointed out, I teach at a school where students come from 100 countries, speak 67 languages, and at the beginning of the school year, we were about 68 to 70% free and reduced lunch. Students, the latest statistics, latest data, we think that we're getting closer to 80% of my students are receiving free and reduced lunch. So that's the context in which I teach, and that will hopefully give you a better sense of, although my students aren't just numbers. So this year, I teach an Honors Contemporary World Issues class and our 11th grade IB History of the Americas class. So this year is a little different because I've got students who have self-selected to be in upper level classes and are motivated. But what I'd like to do is tell you a story about a class that I taught that was not an honors class, and where all of my students were reluctant learners, and how Facing the Future curriculum really just turned around my classroom and turned around both the teaching and the learning that year for my students. So to give you a little background on this class, it was the beginning of October, and I was asked by my principal if I would be willing to take on a new class. If you have conversations with public school teachers in Washington State, you may know that because of the funding formula, sometimes schools are not actually adequately funded to meet the students that they have in their building until mid-October. And so we had more students than we had teachers for, and classes were really large, and this was going on, and we still weren't getting the money, and so my principal asked if I would take on another class. And so my students, who many of whom come from families that are in need, and maybe some of the families are not really that stable, they really come to school looking for stability. They had built community in a class with another teacher for a month, and then all of a sudden they were ripped out from that community and put in my class. And so these students didn't know who I was. They didn't know that I was going to be the best thing that ever happened to them. I'm kidding. So they walk into my class and they hate me. And so they were 50% of the students were still in ELL classes, in English language learning classes. And the other 50% of the students were not strong students. So they were reluctant learners to begin with. Well, my ELL students were not necessarily reluctant learners, but they were struggling in a non-ELL class. But they were reluctant because they were thrown into this new environment. So I surveyed the students, asked what they had learned, and of course, because it was a Contemporary World Issues class, they had all learned different things from their teachers, and so I'm like, oh my goodness, now I don't know where to start. Each teacher's already covered my curriculum, I don't know where to go. So I turned to Facing the Future. Facing the Future had just come out with a 2-week unit plan on sustainability. And so I'm moving through this, and we get to a lesson that's called Shop Till You Drop. And so the title's totally cool, the students are excited, but the activity is really an activity that encourages students to think about issues of consumption and sustainability simultaneously. And so we talk about human needs, and then I give them their global mall dollars. And so students have increments. Some of them are given $200, some are given $1,000, some are given $2,500. And the money is allocated in a way that's proportional to wealth across the world. And so we've got more students who have $200, then we've got some that have $1,000 and some who've got $2,500. And so then we talk about basic needs and what can you buy, and students start identifying their lists, and then we share out. And so the students who have $200 are sharing how they had to decide whether or not they were going to buy a radio or whether or not they were going to buy a bicycle so that they could go to the village to get their supplies. While the students who are at the other end of the spectrum are talking about their cars and whether or not they were going to have air conditioning in their home. And so this was a class of students who were just, well, I don't want to be here. Who is this lady? She took me away from my class. And then all of a sudden, the students are engaged in this conversation. So I have some anecdotal comments from my students that I'd like to share, because after every major unit, I ask them to reflect on what they've learned, and then I'll sort of relate it back to some 21st century skills piece. So some of the comments that my students made, it's funny how jealous and mean I got when I realized that someone had more money than me. Even though I don't have a lot of money, it made me think of what it must feel like to be really poor. So keeping in mind the context of my school, these are students who are not only learning how to collaborate, learning to think critically and to problem solve, they're also building empathy within this classroom. And so then all of a sudden, even though it was something that had the potential to be somewhat contentious, they're building community. And then the interesting piece is that one of the other students said that I learned that the poor weren't the ones who cause most of the environmental problems of the world. Right? So it shifted some of their thinking about what it means to be poor, but also what it means to be rich and how we need to be in conversation. So the students were, so the activity was really a hook, and we engaged in questions. So what are the choices that people with relatively little access to wealth or income can make compared with people with relatively high access? And I had a whole bunch of questions that we went through. But some of the things that were really important, so yes, my students worked on those skills, but most importantly, they forgot that they were learning. So then we talked about, what do you want to know now? And so they started to talk, well, I want to know why some nations are more rich than other nations. And so we start exploring, we have a research project exploring GDP with a class of reluctant learners, and it happened within the space of 2 days. And so then that was it. I could come in any day and students were ready to learn because they didn't realize that we were learning. Yeah. But part of what's important about this is that some of the problems with the testing culture is that my students are often perceived as the students who really need to work on reading, writing, and math. And once they get that, we can move on to higher thinking. My students can do the higher level thinking. They can do the problem solving. And in many ways, that's the way that we can engage them. Once I had them engaged, we were able to work on reading, writing, and in social studies, we did some math. So another example that I'd like to share is, so I started this, the same lesson this year. I did that with an honors level class. Large honors level class, 36 students. And so they were highly motivated. Right away, we go into what do you want to learn, and the list starts. This particular class was really interested in problem solving. So we talked about debt relief. We talked about microcredit. And I had a guest speaker come in to talk about microcredit projects. And the students just thought this was so fascinating. They said, can we do more? And it had been a busy week. This isn't what I had planned. My plan for next week is. And so then I had oh my goodness, there's a microcredit project in one of the Facing the Future resources. And I was like, I'm going to do this tomorrow. So we go in, and the idea for the project is that students research a developing country. They apply for a $100 microcredit grant to start a small business, as if they were a person living in that country. A business plan and a poster are presented to a panel of sustainable development experts. So they not only have to do the project, they also have to think about how to do this project in a sustainable way. And that these experts determine whether or not the plan is economical, social, and environmentally sustainable. And so I do this activity with my students, and they are engaged in 21st century skills. They're researching, they're collaborating, they're problem solving. And one of the neat things for me as a teacher is too often as teachers we are siloed in our discipline. And so, you know, history teachers just teach history. And so in this class, students were doing personal finance. They were having to develop a budget. They were doing some research. They had to evaluate different sources. They had to collaborate with other students. They had to communicate both in writing and speaking and orally. So again, some anecdotal stories from our students, and just want you to keep in mind that these are from 16-year-olds. So one student said, I volunteer for an organization because it makes me feel better, but I never stop to think about what do the people I'm trying to help really need. From this project, I realized that it's important to listen to the people I am trying to help. Another student, this project has made me wonder if we focus too much on trying to come up with big solutions to big problems and forget that people are still hungry. Maybe we need to work on big and small solutions at the same time. And then another student, sort of thinking about the collaboration piece, said, my group was really successful because one of our members was in the marketing class. Next time I'm in a group, I'm going to think about how the group should be diverse and not just pick my friends. And so, I was much older when I realized when I'm planning with my colleagues, I need to pick my colleagues who have a different skill set. And this comes from working on 21st century skills. And so, I can just keep saying this. So I just kind of want to bring us back to where I started and say that I think that we're at a really interesting moment in public education. I think we're moving away from just the chalk and talk and really thinking about what it is our students need. But as we have those conversations, I think we need to think about what do our teachers need. And for me, the Facing the Future, not only as paper resources, but also as a community, has been instrumental in providing a safety net for me as a teacher. This is a cultural shift, and I think that may be part of why we have some loud voices right now. But I think that as those voices who are critiquing our schools are getting louder, I think we need to sort of respond to them with an alternative framework. And I think and focusing on 21st century skills offers us that opportunity. But one of the things that Facing the Future does that I think that very few of the organizations I've seen, they don't do this as well as Facing the Future, is that the content is interdisciplinary. Every single lesson. Students, and not just social studies, interdisciplinary. There's economics and geography and history, but there's also math and science. So as we think about STEM and the focus on technology and math, Facing the Future has been leading this before STEM even became a buzzword. They're also focusing on skills. And for me, the piece that's really important is the focus on problem solving. As a teacher, I think it's unethical for me to teach about contemporary world issues without talking about problems. We need to offer our students opportunities of hope. And so one of the things that the new resource that Facing the Future is working on does is they highlight the work that individuals and communities are doing to help their own situation. Too often, especially when dealing with developing countries, the work that's been doing on the ground is rendered invisible, and Facing the Future is highlighting that. But more importantly, it's also forcing our students to think about problem solving, and not just, yes, we have environmental issues, or yes, AIDS is an issue, or trade is an issue, but what are some real solutions that, I mean, from your perspective, and what is your responsibility as a citizen in that? And the other piece as a teacher, and I promise I'll stop, but the piece as a teacher that's especially important for me is that this work is done with experts in the field. So they are bringing in content specialists, but there's always a teacher at every table. So as resources are being developed, teachers are brought in not only to look at the design and is this user-friendly, but what do you think with this work? Teachers pilot that. And I think that that speaks to the power of why this curriculum is so engaging. So I would like to close with just on a positive note to say that I think that we're at an interesting time. I think that some of you may have heard about the Common Core standards. It's a sort of national movement to create national standards. And the part that breathes hope into to my work is that this work is really about higher level thinking, as opposed to rote memorization that was really part of what this testing culture was about. So I do think the tide is turning. It's probably going to turn really slowly, but I would look forward to having a further conversation about this and would welcome your questions later.